Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us to talk about technology, the great disruptor. Karl Marx once said that capitalism melts all that is solid into air. Joseph Schumpeter said that capitalism was a process of creative destruction. Daniel Bell, the founder of neoconservatism, talked about capitalism tearing up all traditional social relations. And Marshall Berman, one of the founders of the New Left, talked about capitalism's capacity for innovative self-destruction. But I think even by capitalism's very, very high standards, we're going through a process of particularly big disruption at the moment. I think 2/3 of the companies on the Fortune 500 list in 1970 no longer are on that list. Many, many of them no longer exist. The average job tenure of a CEO has fallen from 10 years in 2000 to 5 years today. In 1937, at the height of the Great Depression, the average company on the S&P 500 had a life expectancy of about 75 years. Today, that life expectancy is about 18 years. There are many, many things responsible for this great disruption, but I think right at the heart of it is the subject of the panel today, which is technology. We're seeing a sort of process of technological innovation, technological creative destruction of the sort that we haven't really seen for a very, very long period of time. And we have a very distinguished and very diverse panel of people to discuss this today. Bonin Bao, Vice President of Global Media and Consumer Engagement at Mondelez International. Claire Cockerton, the CEO of Innovative Finance and the Chairman of Pivotal Innovations. David Koenig, the Managing Director of West Coast Control Group. And Matt Ridley, a journalist and a member of the House of Lords. And I wanted to start off by very broadly discussing with the panel what's driving this great disruption. What are the particular technologies which really capture their attention in creating this process of extraordinary creative change that we're seeing? And I wanted to start with Matt over there. What are you seeing that's changing the world?
Well, Adrian, or should I call you Schumpeter, I thought everybody else on the panel would have lots of ideas from Silicon Valley and information technology, so I thought I'd just throw out one that's perhaps a bit surprising, which is electronic cigarettes. I think that the vaping revolution, the replacement of smoking with nicotine inhalation, is going to be one of the biggest lifesavers we've ever seen. This is a technology that's rapidly driving out cigarettes wherever it's allowed to do so, and that of course is crucial. An awful lot of authorities are banning it or making life difficult for this new technology. But the point is that the tobacco companies know the writings on the wall. They are facing their Kodak moment. What happened to Kodak when digital photography came along was total annihilation, and they know they don't want that, and so they're jumping and they're trying to buy up electronic cigarette companies, etc. But the health impacts of this one innovation could be huge if it turns out to be as safe as it seems to be, or rather safer than smoking. And that reminds us that quite a lot of things that change the world aren't necessarily at the forefront of the really high-tech things. They're quite low-tech. I mean, the biggest innovation in health in the 20th century was chlorination, which, as Stephen Johnson describes in his new book, is an idea that was brought in against the law by somebody who knew it could help save lives and had an enormous impact on child mortality, etc., in urban centers all over the world. So corrugated iron was a tremendous invention with a huge impact. So there are disruptive innovations at the low-tech end. That was the point I wanted to make, just to set us off on a slightly odd path.
And it's a classic example of, I think, of Clay Christensen's disruptive innovation. Something starting at the very bottom of the pyramid and then changing a long-established industry with quasi-monopoly providers who are sitting very fat and happy. So I think the electronic cigarette is a great example. Another example. Well, technology, perhaps a different one.
Electronic cigarette, no. Yeah. I think there's a lot of examples of technologies that are changing the way we operate business, but I think what I find more fascinating is that I actually think that there's a difference between organizations that were built of a past generation and, is that? Someone.
No, I think it's the time.
No, it's buzzing. Let me just make sure mine is off, but I'm just going to sit over there in case. Anyway, so I think there's a separation between organizations that were built of a past generation and organizations that were built of this generation. And I think there's a cultural difference. And so when you look at organizations that were built of a past generation, to your point, you can use the word fat and happy, but they were built in a world where it was really about command and control. And the goal was to maintain status quo, to grow incrementality, or to grow incrementally, and to keep competitors at bay and try to squash them. But when you look at this newer generation of organizations, the tech guys are one of the kind of lead of that, but it could be the folks that are driving space, it could be the folks that are driving the transformation in healthcare right now, I mean, so on and so forth. They, and I've talked about this a lot, they kind of embody this notion of kind of a hacker mentality. How do we continue to constantly break things? How do we continue to constantly break ourselves to unlock greater value? And so I think there's just a cultural dynamic that's absolutely different. And when you walk into the halls of a company like Facebook, I mean, everybody's on the back of their T-shirt, they say the hacker way. They have a square called the hacker way. They talk about their life being, or their goal only being 1% complete, where they see that they have to continuously challenge and disrupt themselves before they're disrupted. And when you look at, let's take Airbnb, for example. So if I was Hilton, tomorrow I'd launch Hilton B&B. And Airbnb would have but instead, the hotel industry is trying to legislate them out of business versus actually competing in what is an entirely new business model. It's impossible to tell people who are making their living that you can no longer rent that genie's already out of the bottle. So I guess my real point is that there's a cultural philosophical difference between new generation organizations and how they think and old generation organizations.
Don't you think that new generation organizations are just young versions of old generation organizations? Aren't they going to get fat and happy? Aren't they going to be monopolists?
So it's interesting because we'll see. They will become monopolists. I think when you look at somebody like a Google and you begin to ask yourselves, are they still driving force of innovation, or are now they too big to really be a driving force of innovation? And then you look at movements like buying Motorola for a patent play, which is really to keep other technologies at bay, and you begin to ask yourselves, are they losing kind of that innovation spirit? It's interesting because when you go to places like China has the lax of IP law, and you see the tech companies constantly having to reinvent themselves because there's no way to protect themselves other than being at the speed of technology. I hope that isn't. I hope that the newer generation companies continue to disrupt themselves, but I think time will only tell. But what's interesting though is they've also been able to create value in faster periods of time than older generation organizations have ever been able to.
So we have Matt talking about disruptive innovation and the electronic cigarette as an example of something coming up from the bottom. We have you talking about business models being very radically challenging of established ways of doing things, the capacity for changing things, which is embedded in their culture. Claire, would you like to say something about the finance industry? What innovations are we seeing here that are changing the way the world works?
Sure, absolutely. So we work with Fintech entrepreneurs at Level 39, which is a tech accelerator. And we're seeing young companies develop new data analytics and management platforms who are bringing a whole new level of design and usability to the way in which we understand our internal data, and also how we extract data from externally from unstructured data sources, such as social media. We are working with companies who have new digital currency companies, cryptocurrency companies, and new forms of blockchain, applications of the blockchain technology, a decentralized ledger, public, secure, and a new form of exchange, which is a really exciting technology, which has the potential to change financial services and how we exchange value, units of value, like money, but it also has, the blockchain technology has the capacity to change other industries and other forms of exchange or contracting. We are seeing the rise of alternative finance providers, which is a really exciting trend in the UK. Unfortunately, consumers and enterprises were denied access to credit and to loans, which has given rise in the UK to firms who offer peer-to-peer lending platforms and crowdfunding platforms. And we've set favorable regulation to enable equity crowdfunding to take flight here.
Is the UK an innovator here? Is it on the forefront, do you think?
It is. We are What's so exciting about the last couple years is that our current administration has been very open with industry. They have invited these small companies, these entrepreneurs, and challenger banks to come in to talk about these emerging trends and to set policies that will enable a rebalancing of the sector. So we really are trying to encourage competition and a greater diversity and resilience in the sector with our current policy makers. But as well, our regulator is also very interested in setting forth rules and regulations that enable innovation. And you will have seen at another conference today, the FCA has launched Project Innovate and the Innovation Hub. And so our regulator is really trying to engage with industry to say, what are your challenges? How do we understand your tech? And how do we create an environment that is both pioneering and protecting?
And if you think of the broad history of finance, how important would you say that the current wave of innovations are? Are we reinventing an industry, or is this a minor set of changes?
I think this is a similar evolution that has happened to music with Napster and with Apple and with sharing and Spotify. It's happened to media, where traditional incumbents, so ivory tower incumbents who are seen as the authority and monopolize the public view of information has now changed to now we want the popular opinion. We value Twitter. We value different forms of media. So I think it's a transformation that has happened to music and media and travel and education, and it's now happening to financial services, which is the great democratization of an industry.
Matt?
Yeah, if I can jump in.
Yeah, sure, please.
I actually think this is kind of I think what Claire just mentioned is really the underlying requirement for a lot of the things that we're seeing now, right? We've had a variety of changes over the past 15, 20 years, from the rise of the internet, I won't bore you with that, to the rise of mobility. If you think about it, we all take it for granted, and I imagine everybody here has a smartphone or some variety of it. Steve Jobs and Apple really released it in 2007. Right? So it's really a relatively short amount of time. Those two things made possible democratization, right? The ability for people not only to connect with each other, but to connect with commerce in ways that before they were really unable to do. And I think we see that, we see that in finance, as you said. We see that with companies like Uber. We see that with companies like Airbnb, who are really just taking away, if you want, you call it the ivory tower, but really taking away that structural, institutional loci or node, and saying, hey, we can do things with ourselves and each other.
What's the driver here? Is it the pervasiveness of the internet, the fact that everybody has instant, almost permanent access to it? What's the step change?
I think the driver is access.
Yeah.
Right. I think the driver is access. I think that, and you mentioned we'll talk about that later on, and I think access is, earlier somebody said, I can't remember exactly what it was, but access to the internet, access to spectrum, if you want to stay, is access to economic opportunity today. Yeah. Right? I think that's really is the key here. Right? I'm like, so we do live in a society where I think IT as infrastructure, right? Access as infrastructure need to be viewed as a public good, not necessarily as a private asset. That's a different conversation, possibly.
So it's the ubiquity, the pervasiveness of this technology that leads to a step change, really, in terms of how we relate to each other and to institutions. Everybody can get online immediately.
I think not only can everybody get online, but it offers a way for a two-way communication. Right? So the nice thing, if you think about, there are interesting things happening in smart cities and actually moving beyond just mobility and our own mobility to the Internet of Things and our ability to connect, or devices to connect with each other as well. I think what is interesting about it is that somebody today who walks around the city can have a comment and they can communicate that to a city, and the city can respond, right? There's this notion of immediate one-to-one or two-way communication that is becoming very powerful. And I think that is something that is very unique.
Claire, you want to say something?
Just, I think it's a question of access and having the right kind of digital infrastructure in cities, and having the right technologies to enable exchange of ideas or assets. But I also think there's this rising sense of empowerment that people have, and a rise in entrepreneurship, where everyone is now willing to take their hand at lending, at investing, at starting their own business. And there's a sense that actually, as a consumer, I'm not 100%, I don't put 100% of my trust in my government or in big incumbent institutions. And in fact, if I am given the option to value your business, your opinion, your money, then I might choose that. And I think that we want different options as consumers.
So we can plug into opportunity, but we're also less deferential to the established order of things. Matt, I wanted to ask you about areas of the world that are being reinvented by this great technological disruption. Can you pinpoint an area of the world that you think is going to be dramatically changed, reinvented as it were, in the next few years?
Well, to pick up on something that Claire said and something that David said, I think, as I understand it, and I have to admit that I don't fully understand Bitcoin or blockchain, but I don't think anybody does, actually. So as I understand it, what that technology does is sort of disintermediates. It makes it possible for you and I to trust each other that we both have money to do the exchange without a bank getting involved, without a middleman, without a third party. And the rolling out of that idea, as Claire suggested, across a whole spectrum is going to be fascinating. And I think it's going to lead. So let me give you an example where I think it might lead. And admittedly, it's impossible to forecast technology, so this is probably wrong, but it's a sort of example of what might happen. That in the future, you will not just order a driverless taxi by Uber to your front door, with a whole bunch of other services provided too, like a flu jab, which Uber is already offering. But that taxi will be ownerless. It will belong to a company that has no owner. It will belong to a computer company. It's such a weird idea, and yet actually that's the kind of thing that the people who are looking at blockchain are already talking about. That an entity, an artificial entity on the internet has gone and got itself some capital, has gone and ordered some cars and is running a network. So, I mean, maybe you think that's terrifying. Some people certainly will. There'll be huge resistance to this kind of technology. But we're surely only at the beginning of the rollout of the internet revolution and the digital revolution in terms of things like that. And as David said, it has had a huge impact on communications already, and we're getting used to the fact that it's transformed communications. But that's only one of the industries that the digital revolution is going to change. And I think there are going to be a whole lot of other impacts from it. One of the weird things is that in my lifetime, communications has been utterly transformed, but transport hasn't changed that much. Whereas my grandparents, it was the other way around. Yes. Flight arrived, people went to space, there were all sorts of, you could cross the Atlantic in one jump rather than 2 weeks on a ship, or whatever. So transport changed dramatically, whereas the telephone hardly changed in my grandparents' lives. Well, at least towards the end. It isn't the case that all things go at the same time. We've just lived through a communications revolution. I suspect we're going to see another transport revolution, but it won't be about speed. It'll be about accessibility. It'll be about other people doing the driving. By the way, I want a driverless aeroplane. After reading the transcripts of those Air France pilots messing around over the Atlantic and stalling a plane, I'd quite liked, a computer sitting in the cab instead.
I'm told that 43% of pilots at some point fall asleep involuntarily when they're driving these planes. But I was also talking to somebody at MIT last week who said that he could see very soon the dating companies getting into the Uber business, so they could have shared cars with people of certain shared interests. So on their way to work, or doing the general business of getting around the place, they'd also be able to strike up a conversation, which takes serendipity to new levels.
You and I are sharing a taxi after this.
We are, actually, yes.
But if I could add quickly, there's some really interesting ideas developing around multimodal transportation. For example, I believe that in Helsinki, they're in the middle of doing a pilot or planning a pilot where the city itself is looking to have a singular method for booking transportation, if you want. So you can move through, your subways. You can take the buses. If you go out and there's a bike sharing system, you can go and get on the bike sharing system. If it so happens that it's going to rain, they will actually let you know, hey, you should probably get a taxi, and here's where you get your Uber, or for that. So it's reimagining, right? How do we move to a multimodality?
Exactly.
But what's interesting about that as well is that it's not viewed as a centralized function.
Exactly.
Right? It's looking at the, if you want, at the central TA, transit authority, if you want, within the American context, and saying, how does that become a broker, right, of mobility? Mobility of transportation.
So the distinction between public and private and different forms of transport disappears. It all becomes a means to an end.
I think the point that was made earlier about we're at the very beginning, I think that that's a real subject that we have to really come to grips with, which is the internet is in its infancy. I mean, the internet just turned 18. You know, I mean, now it can drive finally, you know? I mean, like, it's so at the beginning of this, and the infrastructure itself is so brittle. We're talking about technology that was built by Bell Labs in the 70s. That's really what we're operating on. And that is great when you're talking about millions of connections, but when you start talking about things like cities and Internet of Things, you're talking about trillions of connections, and the jump from 1 million to trillions is so dramatic. So what's going to happen over the next couple of decades, first of all, there's going to be a ton of more fortunes built in this industry because the reinvention of infrastructure has to happen, because what we have today that we call internet is not going to take us to where the goal and the vision of most of these entrepreneurs or of these businesses are going to go. And when you look at places that are really exciting, places where they don't have infrastructure, like Africa, and you see what's happening in Africa, where they're using cell phone and Bitcoin technology to rent solar panels, so people can light entire cities now. But what they're also creating is a new infrastructure where before you couldn't deliver a package to somebody because there was no roads, there was no addresses. But now there's a GPS in this phone that's lighting the house as well. So now you can reinvent mail, you can reinvent delivery. So I think that we're going to see a lot more exciting, or we're going to see the pace happen really quickly in a lot of those emerging markets.
Drones are incredibly important in that market. Yeah.
But I mean,
politics too.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you, but I just want to get Claire to say something. An area of the economy that's going to be, or society that's going to be dramatically reinvented in the next few years. Nominate one. And give you an idea.
I'm really excited to be able to talk about something not financial services related. I think synthetic biology is a new area for us, which is really, really exciting. The ability for us to program organisms to perform certain functions, whether those are medical functions, if we're able to swallow a pill that then gets activated to give targeted treatment to certain cells in our body. I think this is very, very exciting. Or the development of biofuels is very exciting. And then perhaps one of the most creative forms of destruction is artificial intelligence. Is this the new ultimate form of creative destruction, where we're creating intelligence machines to potentially replace some functions which we have always thought of as only human? If we are able to give thinking capacity to a machine, what is artificial intelligence? What kind of risks and opportunities does it give us? I think Elon Musk just recently mentioned this in a paper. He's investing in AI companies, one called Veracity, which is also backed by Ashton Kutcher, and this company is developing new artificial intelligence tools to replace fundamental cognitive abilities. Is that the ultimate in creative destruction?
Elon Musk also said that he hopes that humans do not become the bootloader for digital intelligence, for the future digital intelligence. It was a 144-character tweet that I'm destroying, so excuse me.
I sat next
but
to...
it was actually very interesting.
I recently sat next to a very distinguished figure in the world of technological investment who told me that he thought that death was simply something that you forgot to untick on the sort of computer, and the next big innovation would be decide to untick this thing, and then we would no longer die. And this was a person with serious amounts of money. But I wanted to ask a wicked question for Matt in the moment. Say something.
Well, I just wanted to come in a bit cynically on all this, because I think although you're right, what you've just been saying there, some of it is going to be overblown. And let's not forget that, you know,
like the abolition of death.
We've had the abolition of death would be one. We were going to have personal helicopters and things by now, you know. So there are things we're saying now that will look really foolish in 30 or 40 years. But personally, I think biofuels is a dead end because of the simple statistics of how much sunlight you need and how much acreage you need, etc. It takes up too much land. It's not intense enough, as it were. However you do it, even with algae and all that. Personally, I think getting rid of death is not going to work, because if you look at the statistics, the average age is going up, but the maximum age isn't. There are fewer people over 115 alive today than there were 10 years ago.
I didn't know that.
That's really interesting. We're hitting a sell-by date that we can't seem to get past, unless you've got a false birth certificate, which some of those people had in the old days. You know, so don't let's get too carried away with some of this craziness. However, you were going to give me a difficult question.
I want to give you this is the techno-optimist counselling against techno-utopianism, which is good. But I wanted to ask you a slightly cheeky question. I regard you as the one member of the political establishment here, since you're in the House of Lords, and we've talked about the whole world that's being reinvented, and we've talked about the way that in most ways we're at the beginning of this process of change rather than towards the end of it. And yet we have a political system that seems to be, to most people, to be extraordinarily antiquated and extraordinarily impervious to change. How will we change politics?
We badly need to. Yeah. You're absolutely right. Politics is still done in an 18th century fashion. And, you know, here am I as evidence of it. And, you know, we write it down, we stand up. But above all, we have representative democracy, where you elect someone and they go off and take decisions on your behalf. That is going to change, and it's got to change. And it's so easy now for people to take part in referendums, to decide, to use the population as a sort of mass jury, in a way. Right. Now, to do that without the whole thing being taken over by special interests will be a problem. But then, hang on, the present system's taken over by special interests. Yes. So what's so wonderful about that? So if you read someone like Douglas Carswell on the I-democracy, you know, on how he thinks that we could redesign politics in a parliamentary democracy, or even in a congressional version of the system, in such a way that you know. So, for example, if you don't want to vote every day on every policy as a citizen, which most of us don't, because half the point of the world is that you delegate things, then you choose a representative to do it for you on certain subjects, but he might not be the same representative you choose on transport as you choose on defense. Might be a different person. And he doesn't necessarily have to be someone who happens to represent your area. That'll have to go. So you can elect delegates from all over the country, etc. So you can imagine redesigning democracy in such a way. But the one thing you don't do, which I'm a very loyal conservative, so I admire my Prime Minister very much, but they came up with an idea the other day that he was going to be very in touch with high technology, and he was going to have something called Dave's Digital Dashboard.
Not a good idea.
Which meant that he was going to be able to control everything from that. No, that's the wrong idea. Right. That's 180 degrees wrong, I think. And they're going to have to get used to that.
Now, whatever's wrong with the British political system, at least it's better than the American political system.
You're right. You're right. Yeah.
Give us some idea about how to fix America's politics. And the other thing that I'm really concerned about is how do you get talent, you know, into the political system? You know, we're so dependent on high-tech talent in the world, but why would high-tech talent go into solving public sector problems?
I think that's the biggest challenge right there, is that the talent just doesn't exist inside of the governmental system today. You know, to the credit of both governments, the UK, whether it's Tech City, which we backed, bringing in startup thinking and mindset in. That's the closest they're trying to get to kind of that community, or the work that's being done in additive manufacturing, 3D printing, and bringing that close and trying to create a school system. I mean, education is a challenge where we're not teaching, science and math. And I think, though, that bringing talent in, I think we're going to have to change the opportunity that exists. And, I look at an example with the FDA. So years ago, the FDA made a ruling against search advertising, where they no longer allowed pharmaceutical companies to advertise in search because they couldn't talk about the negative effects of the drug in such a short advert. So what happened was all the pharmaceutical companies stopped advertising on search, and then when you searched for a disease, what you got were all elixirs, or there was no real regulated body of information that you now receive, which was horrible and destroyed kind of the patient experience. That's because the FDA had no idea how search worked, and so they had to bring in new talent that said, hey, you can actually help reinvent the healthcare system from inside the government. So I think that the government is going to have to continue to bring the sector close to them, but at the same time create bigger opportunities, which I think we're doing in health tech now, but it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge. But I think that the incubator system that are being run, again, both in the UK and the US and in a lot of countries, is trying to bridge that gap.
I wanted to stick with this medical theme, because we're talking about industries that could be reinvented, but one of the most obvious and challenging and also interesting is medicine. And I wanted you to say something about what we're seeing, what we're going to see in the next few years, I think, which is intelligent devices, the way that devices can be used to monitor your health, to reduce the cost of treatment and cures. Isn't the world of medicine going to be reinvented here?
The world of medicine is being reinvented, and I think what's interesting is that it's also preventative. So we're moving into a state of preventative medicine where I can actually, before I reach a disease state, I can begin to take steps in that direction.
So you'll have sensors telling you and everybody what
sensors,
your health status is.
Claire talked about it, digestibles, ingestibles, all those things are on their way. I think the big challenge is going to be with all this human data, what's going to help provide analysis and synthesis. And so I don't think that the healthcare space as it's built now is prepared to do that. So where am I going to go once I get all the data from my Fitbit, from my T-shirt, from my socks? Now what does it tell me? Who's going to tell me what I have to do with it? And so I think that whole space of analysis of your medical information,
usable data
that I can actually act on. I can act on. But if you look at the entire electronic medical record movement, that was all moving to that space. And so there are companies, Oyster Labs in the US, which is pretty big, which are building the dashboard so you can begin to actually see your medical information in one place. Your doctor can log in, those kind of things. But the piece that's really missing is the analysis. We have all the sensor companies, whether it's the stuff that's being done in Singularity University, where you can, and real sensors, not the Fitbit, stuff that can actually judge, real challenges, real disease states. So we have that technology moving forward, but we haven't seen a huge breakthrough yet in kind of the data analysis component.
And the breakthrough will come from somebody who can give you data that you can use in a form that is simple to understand.
Somebody who can provide analysis of your data for you.
So it's not just a whole
So it's not just here's how many steps I ran, here's how many calories I ingested, here's what my insulin level is, what should I do?
It's the economist of health data. Somebody who makes sense of it.
The economist of health data, or the digital doctor.
Things happening just around that, and really with a simple devices as Fitbits. And clearly it'll get much more complex than that. And there's some projects in the US around the Veteran Administration, right, where you have the ability to have a Fitbit, be able to connect that actually sends data as uploaded to your doctor, right, or to your caseworker within that context, and be able to reply back to you and say, hey, did you take care of this? You forgot to do things. So I think partially it goes back to the notion of, again, the personalization of experience that is possible from that. I don't think we're necessarily going to go to the big mega machine that's going to, tell me, hey, your cholesterol is high, don't forget to take your Crestor or whatever it is, right? I think it'll be more on a personal level as a way to really offer service providers way to meaningfully engage with us, right? Without the need to actually, for us to be there in each particular case.
But I don't think the doctor, my data to doctor is going to be a final solution just because there's not enough doctors. I mean, just the point. And the proliferation is going to be, I'm not sick, but every single day I'm tracking. So that's why I think that there's still a huge gap in that kind of medical analysis space?
I think we've established so far that we're at the beginning, we're on the end of this journey. That technological innovation in lots of areas is going on very, very rapidly, but yet we keep coming across areas where ideas are not being generated quickly enough, or if they are being generated quickly, they're not being applied quickly enough. Particularly we see that in healthcare and Ebola and the rest of it. How can we speed up the process of innovation and application of innovation to practical problems?
I'm going to suggest that maybe I'm going to be a little bit of a contrarian. I was told this is a good thing. I would suggest that we have so much innovation. I'm not sure that innovation has time to really find its fruits, to mature. Right? I'm like, if you look, and this is going to come out of left field, but it's part of my past. I'm like, it took algebra, right, over 300 years to move from the Central Islamic lands, you know, to be part of European transformation, right? It took time for that idea, right, to mature, for people to play with it, for people to understand it. And I think that often we're in a rush to innovate, and we're in a rush to often monetize against those innovations. And at times it can actually trip us, right? Ideas that can be really powerful maybe don't have the time to mature. So it's another view of it, and that's not to say we should not continue.
Give me some sense of an area where that's happened, do you think?
Oh, I knew you would ask that. I think some of it is happening. Please help me. E-cigarettes, yes.
No, I was going to give it a sort of example, which is that if you look at Moore's law, it's extraordinarily regular, okay? And it's telling us something very important, which is that technology moves in an incremental, inexorable, inevitable way, choosing its inventors as it goes. There's nothing clever about inventors. They just happen to be in the right place at the right time. That's a bit harsh, but only just. And you can see that from the fact that there's simultaneous invention. You know, 23 people invented the light bulb in the same 2 decades or whatever. And Moore's law continues. Ray Kurzweil discovers that Moore's law works through different technologies. I mean, if you go right back to the beginning of the 20th century, when you're dealing with with mechanical calculators, it's still on the same trajectory. And so you'd think, well, now we know Moore's law, we can cheat it, we can jump ahead. And that doesn't work. If you read what Alvy Ray Smith and Ed Cartwheel said about starting Pixar, they said, we want to do computer animated films. They looked at it, they said, it's just not affordable at the moment. They came back to it 5 years later, it's still not affordable. And at that point, Alvy Ray Smith sat down and said, I can work out from Moore's law when it is going to be affordable. And he predicted that it would be in 5 years' time, and that's exactly when Toy Story was produced. So it's a very, you know, to use the history of technology as a predictive tool is quite an interesting concept, I think. So that's an example. You know, computer animated films, in theory, could be done in the 1980s. In practice, the technology was still unaffordable.
But I think there is a little bending of the timeline to some extent. I think it relies on scale. And what I think, again, I think we have a bifurcation of really big scaled organizations and then small technology organizations. And the technology organizations can truly benefit from the scale of the big companies. And so, you know, in my position where we invest media dollars on Cadbury, Oreo, all these big brands, when advertising tech comes to me, and you know, they're always, what they see in their mind is, oh, he's going to write me a big check. But my own message to them is, that's actually not where my value is. My biggest value, so we sell billions of products a month. Facebook has 1 billion users, 1.2. Imagine if I put your technology on every single pack that I sell across the world. I might be able to stand up 6, 7, 8 Facebooks in a month. Now that's very theoretical, but my scale is what can help change the time frame and the curve of technology. So we can, and that is the same thing whether you're talking in the healthcare profession, the big established healthcare companies versus the small emerging tech. So how do you begin to marry those two together, big industry and emerging tech, in a way that big industry doesn't feel like they have to protect themselves from it, but they actually see that they can unlock and create greater value for both. And to date, there's still Blockbuster standing on the sideline saying Netflix is never going to win, versus helping Netflix accelerate their growth and both win together. Or Hilton and Airbnb, you name, said Amazon, you know, Borders, you name it. So I think that that connection has still not been made. And the smart entrepreneurs realize that scale is the game, and they go and they seek out those opportunities. But still, I think a lot of the big industries are too protective.
I think it's starting to happen in financial services, and in the last year we've seen at the accelerator and in organizations like Innovate Finance, large incumbent corporations moving away from this obsession about ownership and build it ourselves and our internal R&D departments towards realizing that many of the most interesting technologies or access to new customers are coming from outside of the organization.
Right.
And they're starting to sponsor accelerator programs,
Right.
they're launching their own accelerators, and they're trying to find more advanced models to partner with external firms. And I think that's a really exciting.
And one thing I wanted to ask you about, which is a word we haven't used yet on this panel, but as somebody who works with economists, I'm obliged contractually to mention, which is regulation. To what extent is regulation a constraint upon innovation?
Yeah, this is absolutely critical. It just goes back to the other point about, I don't think there's a shortage of ideas. There's mass proliferation at the moment in ideas, but we're just starting to see the confluence of the market forces coming together to enable some of the really great wins to grow. So this requires a consumer environment that's ready to adopt the new technologies. It requires investors to get behind the real big, the wins, the great teams, the companies that are sound enough to grow quite rapidly. It requires policymakers and regulators also to understand the emerging tech, to develop the expertise in-house, to understand what are those business models, what are the technologies we need to be aware of, adopt some of them themselves, but also understand how to create an operating environment for those young companies to prove their worth as businesses and as new tech.
A regulation you'd change. What would you change?
A regulation.
To speed up innovation, is there anything obvious that you think we could?
I think a really important change which is happening at the moment in financial services is opening up the infrastructure, the payments infrastructure in particular, providing access to banking services to some young firms who are being denied basic banking services and clearing abilities. I think that we are experimenting with the mandate for large corporations if they deny a customer a loan to mandate referrals to an alternative provider. That's interesting. And I think right now we're also trying to provide a framework for us to understand the potential of blockchain and what it's going to do for currency and for money
Any
transfer.
other bids for regulations to change?
I think that there's some stuff that's happening in the US through the Science Advisor, like an attempt to really move outside of exclusive spectrum rules, but really to open rules around spectrum. So spectrum availability becomes available when it's open without actually crossing boundaries that create different kind of pay structures, et cetera.
Can I come in?
Yes, well, two more on regulation.
An example of regulation, agriculture. It's clear now that Europe, by regulating genetically modified crops out of the picture for the last 20 years or so, has locked itself into an older and much worse technology called spraying, basically. You know, that if we'd gone down the route of plant protection as a genetic trait rather than a chemical trait, we'd be in a much better position environmentally. And we're now banning a whole bunch of sprays on the grounds that we're not sure they're safe, but we don't have that genetic technology to fall back on.
And that's something in Europe more than anywhere else.
It's far worse in Europe than in North America. It affects Africa because Africa wants to export to Europe, and so it has to roughly follow what happens in Europe. But it is clear to me that that's a very good example of where regulation has actually driven us to a worse technology rather than a better one. It's caused us to shoot ourselves. I mean, energy may be another example. We're about to build an unbelievably expensive nuclear power station in this country. And if you look at the curves of what's increased per megawatt of capacity in nuclear power stations, steel goes up, you know, concrete goes up, all these things go up as people add bells and whistles about safety. But the thing that really goes up fastest is the amount of paper you need to build a nuclear power station.
Right.
In other words, the amount of regulatory pages, etc.
Right. then?
Yeah, no, I think we're going to see changes in financing and investment when we look at the crowdsourced, crowdfunding kind of movement and what it means to be an accredited investor. And I think that's interesting because I think it's going to allow people to be a new part of this new, dream of wealth creation and value creation. So I think there's something interesting there. Clearly, Bitcoin. I also think patent is going to be looked at. I think right now there's a lot of protectionism in patents, which actually slows down innovation.
Indeed.
But I do want to come back to one point, which the incubator point, and having those inside of organizations, because I can't say enough about how important culture is and understanding that these organizations have a different type of culture. So we launched an incubator 3 years ago, a mobile incubator, where we partnered our brands with emerging tech, 9 companies. We've done it around the world, actually, 4 classes now. And we made our folks go and work for the companies for 1 week because we wanted them to have a culture mindset transfer change. And I'll tell you, every single one of them, the first thing that they came back and said is, should we go work for a startup? And I said, no. Because if my top marketers quit, I'll get fired. We need to focus. We said, imagine bringing that same mindset to big brands, big resources, and beginning to think. And we started calling those folks entrepreneurs and really cultivating this notion of entrepreneurship, be an entrepreneur inside of a big organization. And now when we look at the plans of all of those graduating class, the mindset shift is so different. They're thinking differently. They also have networks and connections back at Silicon Valley or wherever the tech center was where we launched it. And so I encourage big organizations to bring that type of thinking in-house as much as possible to change the mindset of the folks that work for you. That's the only way you're going to disrupt yourself before being disruptive. And we've seen lessons taught time and time again of people who haven't done that.
I want us now begin to disrupt this panel a little bit by focusing on the issue of inequality. It strikes me that this is a big problem, something we need to address, and it's a problem that in some ways is being exacerbated by innovation, by new technology. There are huge winners and other people are being left badly behind. And I want to focus the question on what can we do to make sure that technological disruption, technological innovation includes people who might be regarded as losers. What can we do about the poor in the rich world, and what can we do about the emerging world? Claire, can you say something about making sure everybody benefits from innovation and technology?
Yeah. Increasing participation.
Exactly.
The common example we talk about in financial services is M-Pesa. It's the mobile banking application which is now passing about 45% of Kenya's GDP on a mobile platform, which is incredible. It's enabling farmers, business people in small remote communities to have access to banking services, to exchange, to access payments infrastructure, which is really fantastic. I think you bring up another point about how do you encourage participation and increase social inclusion. And in financial services, it's really important that we encourage greater financial literacy. So teaching young people to manage their money in a better way.
Or old people.
Oh, and old people as well. Manage your pensions in a much more informed way. And I think there's a huge role for education to play in encouraging young people to take responsible action about their own funds, about building their own wealth, about leveraging that wealth. Yeah. And I think financial literacy is a huge part of social inclusion.
Why hasn't M-Pesa spread more? They keep being told about Kenya, Kenya, Kenya. Why hasn't it spread to the rest of the emerging world, or even to the richer world?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Jealous central banks, isn't it?
Is it? It's interesting.
Yeah. I don't have a definitive answer for that.
And do you think there's a potential for these sorts of mobile payments to come here, to the rich world?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's a proliferation of mobile payments
That's
companies in the US and the UK. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And there's going to be a mass extinction in mobile payments industry as well, I think, or a great M&A activity as well.
How about poorer people using crowdfunding as a way of starting their own businesses? Is that happening?
Yes, and I think this is one of the great potential potential economic benefits of fintech in general is it allows the restaurateur or
democratizing.
And also young entrepreneurs and business people in other industries to access the much needed initial seed capital to fund their businesses. Companies like Cedars and Funding Circle and a whole slew of other peer-to-peer lending platforms are creating a wonderful movement of entrepreneurship and lending and investing, which is encouraging greater participation in financial services and an awareness of financial the actual value proposition of financial services, and people are starting to compare across different models, which is a good thing.
David, inclusive growth, empowering the people who are not necessarily winners at the moment, technology that can do that.
Yeah, I think they're the combination of things. I think on the one side, you need to actually have access to the means of communication if you want, the ability to have what I called spectrum or earlier, the ability to engage from an infrastructure point of view. I think the other component is really being able to engage with communities in ways that is meaningful to them from the point of view of product innovation. I think that there's ideas around design, around design thinking that really kind of say, what are needs of populations as opposed to saying, use this, right? And learning how to really build product that are more.
I wanted to ask you about this because one of the biggest constraints on people's lives, many young people, is housing. It's expensive. It takes up a huge chunk of their income if they're young in London, or if they're living in Mumbai, it's hard to get. You live in a slum. What can we do to apply technological innovation to improve access to this basic sort of thing of life? Housing, places to live.
I thought Airbnb.
Matt,
I think that illustrates a really good point, which is that technology hasn't driven inequality, it's driven equality. It's been a huge equalizer. When you think about it, everybody in this room is probably rich enough to have a mobile phone, but the really, really rich people in this room haven't got that much better a phone. They've got, they might have sapphires on the case or something, but so what? The point here is that the things that are driving inequality in countries like this are, as you say, housing. Right. They're old tech and they're highly regulated sectors. So, there's all sorts of things you could do to innovate in housing if it weren't such a cozy industry that was entirely dependent on government permission to build, etc. And if you look at the world as a whole, people thought mobile phones were an irrelevance as far as economic development was concerned in poor countries to start with. Turned out to be utterly wrong. Sure. It turned out that Indian fishermen could call from the sea to find out where to land their catch because etc. Farmers in all over Africa, it made an enormous difference. Unemployed people could advertise their numbers on bits of cardboard stuck to telephone poles in rural parts of Africa to say, I'm looking for a job. There are all sorts of ways in which this technology was advantageous. And let's not forget that global inequality is declining rapidly. Mozambique's GDP is 60% larger than it was in 2008. Italy's is 6% smaller. That's because, people in poor countries are getting rich much faster than people in rich countries at the moment, and a lot of that's to do with technology. So I don't think we should fall into the trap of saying technology is driving inequality. Wherever technology is allowed to, it's helping people become more equal. And things like housing are because there isn't enough technology.
But if you think of the big things that eat up our income, it's housing, healthcare, education. What can we do to change that dynamic?
Well, education's a good example. That's still stuck in not even a 17th century mode, it's a 13th century mode where you have one man standing up in front of a group of other people, or woman, I don't know, person. The MOOCs and online education, the Khan Academy, what Sugata Mitra is doing with self-organized learning through the internet, etc. Education is going to be utterly transformed by these technologies. And, Sugata's already got retired teachers in England teaching courses in Indian slums through the internet. Now, I think that's an equalizer.
But I do think we have to, I agree. But I do think we have to be honest around how the technology industry is growing. There are still vast inequalities with inside tech. There's a lack of women founders in technology. Let's just be honest. There's a lack of diversity inside of technology. So I do think we have to, in that industry, we have to admit that there are inequalities that are exacerbating. But so first, education is going to be completely transformed. And I think that that's what's really exciting. And it's driven by that mobile device. I mean, the mobile device, more mobile phones are turned on than babies are born. And the proliferation and pace, and it's only 7 years old, as David said earlier, and so that's changing. There's a program that are putting textbooks on SIM cards that are passing them out to kids who can't afford textbooks. And now they're learning greater because it's actually almost like playing a video game on their parents' old mobile phone. So I think technology is going to transform education. But I also think what's exciting is in the same way that space gave a generation the belief that they could change the world, the entrepreneurship that we're seeing, when you see 21-year-olds creating businesses that are worth billions of dollars, you see it happening again and again and again, the youth of this world are energized now to say, hey, we can actually change the world and build things that we don't have to wait until we're 50. And that's what I think is that piece is really, really exciting.
Completely agree, but back to your first point, the wiki economy, where we're all sharing and we don't need to have financial things. It's all going to be, touchy-feely and sharey. As Tom Hazlett said, there sure seem to be an awful lot of billionaires in this wiki economy.
I would say that I agree with that, but I would say that there's one sort of disruption we haven't talked about perhaps enough during this panel, which is frugal innovation coming from the emerging world, which is not about whiz-bang technology. It's not about making things more complicated and not making things ultra high-tech. It's actually about making things cheaper, simpler, radically cheaper. So you're getting products in the medical service sector which are 10% of the cost of old products. You're getting, Tata now is putting a lot of money into the whole process of designing a $300 house, a slum, but a slum that actually is much better than the sort of slums that most people live in. And I think it's dangerous to become too fixated on high tech and on Silicon Valley, because a lot of the disruptions, a lot of the innovations that are going to change the world in the next few years are simple, low tech, slum housing that is just much, much better than the sort of places that people in Mumbai are living, taking out the bells and whistles in order to democratize ideas that have been around for a long time.
But I do think one of our largest challenges is education as a global society, as defined by the UN, and I think the biggest change in education will come from access to mobile phones. I actually find
and tablets.
Yeah, and fair enough.
Presumably.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it's that funny. But I mean, a lot of what you can do is have teachers actually basically acting as childminders, keeping some order in classrooms, and have most of the instructions coming through the tablets. And these tablets, Bill Gates sends his children to the Khan Academy to help them with their homework and to help them with their algebra. That is something which basically everybody can do, will be able to do. So that is one area in which you have a radical democratization of access.
To add to what Bonham said earlier, I think that it's really important that there's a mind shift, right? Millennials, if we want to call them that.
Millennials are old now, by the way.
Yeah. As I was saying that, I was like, wait a minute. There's really a mind shift of people that say we can actually change the world, right? We can really do things that are meaningful, and they actually want to. I think there were in some of the other panels that I was at around crossing the borders in education and so on. Right. Like, one of the things is just about that. It's about, there's a real sense of empowerment that is a result of this democracy.
The trouble is too much of technological innovation is being driven by irresponsible 18-year-olds who just want their laundry done cheaper and things like that. We want people who are thinking about big problems that confront the poor rather than yuppie problems that confront idle people in Silicon Valley.
Yes, and I think we need to bring more people into the conversation.
I do think that's important.
I think that is a critical imperative, actually. Right, to bring a new audience.
Sorry, you're in defense of idle people in Silicon Valley. Sorry.
Oh yeah. I think you're being very snooty there. But I was just going to make another very quick point on your point about frugal innovation. If you haven't seen it, go on YouTube and look up the lever axe, which is a Finnish invention where this guy has redesigned the axe so that it deliberately swerves to one side when it hits the wood, and as a result, it splits the wood very quickly. So it's just unbelievably more efficient at chopping logs. Now, that could have been done any time in the last 8,000 years, but he happens to have done it right now. It'll save an enormous amount of time and energy for people who have to chop wood, which doesn't, on the whole, include most of the people in this room, I'm sure. But
well, on that inspiring note with the Finnish axe reinvention, I'd like to thank all the panelists for a really interesting panel. Thank you very much. Thank you.